This video is about creating a solid foundation for your data analysis in relation to thematic analysis, but it's also open to any different types of analysis. I think it applies to many other different types because it's about really how to create a solid foundation when you do your data analysis. And the concepts are almost, almost all shared between everything, all types of analysis. The material was taken from Brown and Clark's book, Thematic Analysis, A Practical Guide, and another one by Byrne, the author Byrne, a worked example of Brown and Clark's approach to reflexive thematic analysis, which was published by Qualitative Quantity, and the DOI number is available there. So you are doing your analysis, or just before you start, maybe you already started. How do you create a solid foundation? And this is especially the case and important, let's say, if you stumble upon few roadblocks. So these are some sort of tips I've put together about things that are critical that you need to consider or think about while you do your analysis, or just before you do your analysis, while you do your analysis, or if you hit some roadblocks while you are analyzing your data. So maybe it has got something to do with some of these concepts over here. So first of all, think about while you analyze, consider the following. Your values. This tends to be something that is missed from most students' minds when they start doing analysis or just before. Think about subjectivity as an asset in reflexive thematic analysis. This is something that is celebrated in Brown and Clark's thematic analysis method, which is very specific. It's called reflexive thematic analysis. So think about your subjective opinions as an asset rather than something to avoid and to disguise and to get rid of. So this is important. Think about your perspectives and that these needs to be embraced. They need to be acknowledged. And think about your subjectivity as influencing the way that you look at the data, the way that you group these data, and the way that you come up with tentative themes. So this is how you think about your subjectivity as influencing your analysis. Think about your background, think about your experience, the way that you look at the world, your political, perhaps, social, environmental, cultural opinions. All of these things are very important. Think about them before you start your analysis, or even while you're doing your analysis and you hit a roadblock. And also think about your lived experience in terms of shaping your research all the way to data analysis, because sometimes some of these things might be influencing your analysis without you even thinking about it. So embrace these things, document them when you see them happening, because this is part of being reflective in a reflexive thematic analysis process. Second thing to think about, which is very important, is your approach to research. Is it inductive? Is it deductive? Or is it something in between that they call abductive approach? So there seems to be two different within between orientations, if you like, to data analysis and reflexive thematic analysis. An inductive, which tends to be more leaning towards reality, experiential approach, and semantic approach to data. And on the other hand, there is a deductive approach to research, which is more latent or linked with latent, relativist, constructionist, critical approach to your data analysis. So these bring different ways of approaching your data analysis, informed by your paradigm, which is your ontology and epistemology. And these are not mutually exclusive. They are points that sit on a spectrum. And these qualitative analytic orientations to data, whether driven by experiences, perspectives, and meanings, of the participants, which is in this case inductive. You are doing an inductive approach to analysis, or theory or researcher-driven analysis that look at the data and where you notice that if there are any strong connections to theoretical ideas early on in the process, and you start coding around such concepts. So it is, in terms of the deductive approach, it is about enriching an empirically based understanding of a theoretical concept. And then there is something in between these two, which is abduction or abductive approach. It is a third approach, if you like, to analysis, where you use theory to make sense of some sort of curiosities in the data, and or use data to extend, modify, or dispute existing theory. So these are really interesting and very, very important concepts to think about: the inductive, deductive approach, or in-between approach to your research. Then also you need to think about your qualitative research orientation. This is something that I haven't seen until I read Brown and Clark's book about thematic analysis. But they seem to actually put a section on that in their book, which is, after reading it, I found out that it was a useful thing to think about. So Brown and Clark seem to place qualitative research orientation within an experiential versus critical research orientations as a useful method or way for students to start to think about which orientation we lean towards, both conceptually and theoretically. And I divided these into a table to make it easier for you to differentiate between both. So experiential orientation or research orientation seem to be connected with an analytic orientation of what they called in their book hermeneutics of empathy. So in this case, you as a student, you tend to stay close to participants' accounts or meanings and capture these in ways that are recognizable to them. So this is an experiential orientation. If you're following that, then you're following an experiential orientation to your research. On the other hand, the critical orientation seemed to involve unpacking patterns of meaning and interrogating data in a way that centers on the effects and function of the language use and meaning in the data. And you can find these under page 158 of their book. So language here is critical to think about, the use of language. Language here within the critical orientation is not a way to convey truth or reality. Rather, it forms a crucial part of the way truth and reality are put together. Critical orientation typically is informed by the analytic orientation of hermeneutics of suspicion, which is where we ask critical questions of the data, meanings, and interrogate the claims and truth behind the data. So it draws heavily on you as a researcher and your theoretical resources. So you've got hermeneutics of empathy with the first one, with experiential orientation, versus hermeneutics of suspicion, which is driven by you and your theories rather than the language coming out of people and what people are saying. So these are very two different and really interesting ways of thinking about your research and your orientation, the way that you're looking and the way that your research is being carried out. And there is another very important aspect to think about is language, which is connected with the previous point. So attention to language seems to be another key aspect to consider, as it affects the way that you look at participants' accounts. So Brown and Clark made a note that the critical realist, contextualist, and phenomenologist, and to a lesser degree constructivist theoretical frameworks are more loosely underpinned by intentional theorization of language. So think about that. They also stated that their understanding of language use is crucial as it shapes the claims that you are making about your data. And they provided an example about what do they mean by that under box 6.3 of their book. So think about these. Think about the language and intentional use of language when you are coding the paragraphs, and how you're treating the language, and which way is it leaning towards, because that that is linked to your ontology and then to your epistemology, which I will come into in the next section. So next part is think about your ontology. Before you start your analysis, while you're doing your analysis, or if you get stuck when you are doing your analysis, think about your ontology. So, and I will do a separate video about how to think about ontologies and epistemologies in a very useful way. But for now, I'll give some introductions based on Brown and Clark's book and the resource by Byrne. So think about your paradigms, your ontology and epistemology. For now, think about the ontology and check whether you have an alignment in these within your research practice. What is permissible, ideal, and what doesn't make any sense. So I found personally Brown and Clark's way of thinking about ontology is very useful. Basically, you need to answer the following question that they put in their book to understand and to think about your ontology. Is there a reality that exists separately from your research practice? So think about that for a second to establish and to understand your ontology. If you answered yes, then your research leans towards what they call realism. If you answered no, then you're leaning towards relativism. If your answer is kind of yes and no, or depends, then you sit within, or your theory of reality sits within what they call critical realism. So think about these. And I'll give an example using their book of how they looked at critical realism and relativism. So critical realism is if your data don't provide you with a clear and direct reflection of reality, but provides you with access to a mediated reflection of reality. In this reality, you access participants' perceptions of their reality, embedded within their cultural context, language, etc. They bring a located, interpreted reality, which is the data, which then you interpret via the thematic analysis or other ways of analyzing data. So your job becomes to really provide a coherent and compelling interpretation of the data, grounded in or anchored by participants' constraints of the world that the participants exist within. So this is critical realism as an ontology and what it means. Now, let's look at how Brown and Clark looked at relativism and see whether you fall within that theory of reality. So if you believe that there is no such thing as reality that exists independent of human practices, then you fall within this ontology. Reality and truth are contingent, multiple, and located within this paradigm. It is anti-foundationalist, where the ultimate truth is rejected. In this kind of orientation, or in this ontology, we can't assume anything beyond, beneath, or behind the thing we are seeking to understand. Truth is developed from the analysis. In terms of analysis, this means that you don't need to tie meanings conceptually to some sort of ultimate meaning of a concept. Instead, your job as an analyst becomes to focus on your analysis on the implications and consequences of such meanings that comes from people. This doesn't mean you dodge context altogether during your analysis. Meaning would still be context dependent rather than free-floating. However, there is no foundational truth that would provide some sort of validation and anchoring. Analysis here are more of a reading So there is no truth or accuracy in the analysis. So your job becomes to convince the reader why your account matters and an account of your meaning making. Okay, so these hopefully gives you an idea of two different ontologies that Brown and Clark defined or looked at and explained in their book, and they explain other types of ontologies as well in their book. And then we come to the next natural part, which is your epistemology. Maybe you've established your ontology, you've established the other aspects that we looked at before in the previous slides, but maybe you're stuck with your epistemology. What does that mean? So at the essence of epistemology, we are really concerned with what modes of information do we trust as real, true, valid sources of information, and how can such knowledge be best generated? So Brown and Clark seem to have discussed three major and known epistemologies. Two of them seem to be closest, contextualism and constructionism. And apologies for that, they're very hard to pronounce. So if we take, say, contextualism and what it means, apart from the fact that it aligns, so it seemed to, as an epistemology, it seemed to align with the ontology of critical realism and considered a weaker version of constructionism, where ultimately there is still a truth out there, but we acknowledge as researchers that we need to find out different versions of that truth. It is just that we pick the ones, the truths, if you like, that are more valid and make our research case stronger. There is also some sort of negotiation between the participants and researchers. The data are situated and seem to be more locally focused. Reality is considered multiple and perspective-driven, in contrast to, say, positivist reality, which is one and objective. In contrast, let's look at constructionism. It creates reality using the language spoken, written by participants. Their reality exists in their language, hence there is a big focus on language in here. Our role becomes like an artist trying to create rather than reveal or reflect something with our skills, tools, and techniques and cultural resources. So language is not neutral in here within this epistemology. Rather, it is active and it is alive. It does things and brings realities into being something. There is no one social constructionism version with many influencers over the years, over its development. So this is important to realize that there are very many different versions of this epistemology that is called constructionism. So you need to really look at the different people and the authors that theorized about this epistemology and see where you fall. This is very important to note. This school of knowledge generation does not deny the existence of the material world. It is just that it starts to exist the moment we name this part using discourse. Hence, language is part of what makes things a reality. With constructionists, everything is viewed as a social construct. Reality does not exist outside of the human practices, so it is anti-foundationalist. This is important to note. Constructionist thematic analysis, for example, tries to dig into what or how reality has been made or constructed and the implications of these realities. It is considered an empirical tradition for generating knowledge where data are generated and analyzed. And Brown and Clark brilliantly, they discuss this in another box, about the differences between constructionism and constructivism, two very different terminologies and very different concepts, and I'll do a separate video on these. So then finally, I think I put differences between semantic and latent coding as something that is important because it's something that again, I struggled with and I needed to know about, and I believe other students might be finding themselves also tangled into. So very useful way of looking at semantic versus latent coding. So when you're doing your coding, think about there are different ways of looking at your data, and they call these semantic versus latent coding. So if you are trying to answer certain ideas by looking at your data, then semantic coding is used, okay? Then you're using semantic coding. If you are trying to see what other ideas participants raise implicitly through the data, then you're using latent coding. Another thing to think about, the differences between both, which is useful, is that what makes a code latent is not about using the words participants say in a text. So this is something, again, to differentiate between both, which is very useful. So hopefully this video gave you an idea about the how to create solid foundations for your data analysis, which is something that you need to address if you're doing a PhD and even a research project. And it relates to thematic analysis, but equally it could actually relate to any other types of analysis because it is about establishing a strong foundation for your data analysis and your research in general.